The history of warfare is often written in the blood of soldiers and the steel of tanks. But the most devastating defeats often happen in the quietest moments. In August 1944, as the Allied forces tore through the heart of occupied France, a small group of German women was captured near the town of Chartres. They were not frontline killers. They were the Blitzmodell, the female auxiliaries of the Third Reich. These women were the radio operators, the stenographers, and the communication links that kept the Nazi machine breathing. They were young, mostly in their early 20s, and they had been raised in a world where the truth was whatever Joseph Goebbels decided it would be. To these women, the American soldier was not just an enemy. He was a monster. For years, they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that painted the United States as a nation of starving, uncultured degenerates, a country on the verge of collapse that could only produce Hollywood illusions. They were told that if they ever fell into American hands, they would face unspeakable brutality. This fear was their armor. It kept them loyal even as the ground beneath their feet began to crumble. When they were taken into custody near a dusty signal depot, they expected a bullet or a cage. They expected the nightmare they had been promised. But what they encountered was a reality so alien, so fundamentally different from the lies they had lived, that it began to dissolve their identities before they even reached a prison cell. The Americans didn't scream at them. They didn't strike them. They moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency, treating the women not as hated enemies, but as administrative tasks to be processed. The journey across the English Channel was a descent into the unknown. Locked in the dark hulls of transport ships, the women shared whispers of dread. They believed they were being sent to labor camps where they would be worked until they withered away. They watched their guards, young Americans who seemed bored, craning against the railings, chewing gum and tossing chocolate wrappers into the sea. To the German women who had lived under strict rationing for half a decade, the sight of a soldier casually discarding a piece of silver foil, a luxury in Berlin, was the first crack in the wall. By the time they arrived at a specialized American-run camp in southern England, the psychological exhaustion was peaking. They were stripped of their ranks, their papers were filed away, and they were led into a fenced enclosure. But the camp was not the dungeon of their imagination. It was a place of eerie, clinical order. There were wooden barracks with actual heating, clean blankets, and windows that let in the pale English sun. The Americans provided them with medical care, not out of kindness, but out of a terrifyingly high standard of logistics. The women sat on their bunks in silence, looking at their clean hands and the solid roofs over their heads. They were waiting for the trap. They were waiting for the moment the Americans would reveal their true, savage nature. They had been told for 10 years that National Socialism was the only system capable of providing order and prosperity. Yet, here they were, in the heart of the enemy's territory, experiencing a level of organization and material wealth that made the shrinking Reich look like a crumbling ruin. The tension in the camp was thick. It was the tension of 1,000 lies being challenged by a single, inescapable truth. The enemy was not hungry. The enemy was not weak. And the enemy did not seem to hate them as much as they had been told to hate the enemy. As the first week came to a close, the administration announced a change in the meal schedule. The German women lined up in the mess hall, their metal trays clutched tightly in their hands. They expected the usual thin soup and sawdust-filled bread that had become the standard of the German war effort. They expected the taste of defeat. Instead, the air in the hall began to change. A scent began to waft from the kitchen, a heavy, rich, almost overwhelming aroma of melted fats and toasted grains. It was a smell that belonged to a world before the war, a world of grandmothers and Sunday mornings. It was the smell of butter, real unrationed, golden butter. In the kitchen, American cooks were moving with a casualness that was insulting to the German sense of wartime struggle. They weren't scraping the bottom of a barrel. They were opening crates of white bread, so soft it looked like cake. They were slicing blocks of cheese that were bright, vibrant, and abundant. To the Americans, this was a streamlined lunch, a quick way to feed a crowd using surplus supplies. To the German women, it was a display of power, more frightening than any artillery barrage. One by one, the women moved down the line. A cook, not even looking at them, flipped a sandwich onto each tray. It was hot. It was heavy. It was a grilled cheese sandwich. They carried their trays to the long wooden tables, moving like ghosts. They stared at the food as if it were a high-explosive device. The bread was toasted to a perfect, even brown, glistening with grease. The cheese was oozing out from the sides, a molten river of luxury that they hadn't seen in years. In Germany, cheese was a luxury, a tiny cube of something hard and bitter that you saved for a week. Here, it was being served as a common sandwich. One of the younger girls, a radio operator who had spent the last 2 years listening to reports of German victories while her own stomach growled with hunger, picked up her sandwich. Her hands were shaking so violently that the bread rattled against the metal tray. She looked at her older comrade, a typist who had lost her brother at Stalingrad. The older woman's face was a mask of disbelief. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of American trucks outside, a reminder of the endless supply chain that fueled this abundance. The girl took her first bite. The crunch of the buttered crust echoed in her ears, followed by the soft, salty creamy rush of the melted cheese. It was an explosion of sensory information that her brain struggled to process. For a moment, she forgot about the war. She forgot about the Führer. She forgot about the great Germanic struggle. There was only the warmth, the salt, and the terrifying realization that the people who made this were not the degenerates she had been taught to despise. As the flavor coated her tongue, the wall of propaganda she had lived behind for a decade didn't just crack, it shattered. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel grateful. She felt a deep, soul-crushing sense of betrayal. As the warmth of the melted cheese spread, it brought with it a cold, hard clarity that no interrogation could have achieved. The young radio operator did not swallow immediately. She held the morsel in her mouth as if it were a piece of evidence. Around her, the mess hall remained eerily silent. But the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to a heavy, suffocating grief. These women, who had been trained to endure the freezing winters of the Eastern Front and the relentless fire of Allied bombers, found themselves defeated by a simple lunch. In Nazi Germany, food was a weapon of control. For years, the ersatz policy had replaced the real with the fake. They drank coffee made of roasted acorns. They ate bread stretched with sawdust. They consumed margarine that tasted of industrial chemicals. They had been told this was a noble sacrifice for the Endsieg, the ultimate victory. They believed that the entire world was suffering just as they were, and that the German spirit was simply stronger than the rest. But as they looked at the Hafitan sandwiches on their trays, the noble sacrifice suddenly looked like a pathetic, unnecessary tragedy. This realization was a silent explosion, shattering their loyalty and exposing the hollow core of the regime's promises. If their leaders could not provide bread, how could they ever provide a future? Every bite tasted like the bitter end of an empire. The older typist, who had maintained a facade of ironclad stoicism since her capture, slowly lowered her sandwich. Her eyes were fixed on the golden grease staining the paper napkin. To an American soldier, that grease was a nuisance. To her, it was a miracle. It represented a nation that had so much surplus, so much fuel, and so many resources that they could fry bread in butter for their prisoners. She realized in that moment that the German High Command had lied about more than just the progress of the war. They had lied about the very nature of reality. The psychological impact of abundance is often more destabilizing than the impact of cruelty. Cruelty breeds resentment and resistance. It gives the prisoner an enemy to hate and a reason to stay strong. But this casual, indifferent abundance stripped them of their dignity. It made their struggle feel small. If the Americans could feed their captives like royalty while German mothers were starving in the basements of Berlin, then the war was not a clash of equals. It was a massacre of a starving nation by a giant that wasn't even breaking a sweat. One of the younger women suddenly stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She didn't say a word, but her face was contorted in a silent scream. She turned and ran out of the mess hall, leaving her tray behind. The American guards didn't chase her. They didn't even draw their weapons. They simply watched with a look of mild confusion, as if they couldn't understand why a sandwich would cause a nervous breakdown. This indifference was the final insult. To the Americans, this meal was nothing. To the German women, it was the end of the world. Back in the barracks, the silence was broken by the sound of muffled sobbing. It began with one girl in the corner and spread like a contagion. They weren't crying for their families or their lost homes. They were crying for the loss of their certainty. For a decade, their lives had been a rigid architecture of truths. They believed they were the elite of Europe. They believed the Americans were a mongrel race of weaklings. Now, every bite of that sandwich sat in their stomachs like lead, a heavy reminder that they had been the ones who were weak. They were the ones who had been deceived. The whispers were no longer about escape or the miracle weapons Hitler had promised would turn the tide. The whispers were about the trucks. They had watched from their windows as endless convoys of American supplies rolled past the camp. They saw crates of oranges, mountains of white flour, and drums of fuel that seemed to have no end. They compared this to the German retreat they had just escaped, where horses were being slaughtered for meat, and tanks were abandoned because there wasn't a single liter of petrol left in France. The realization was a slow-motion car crash. If the Americans had this much food in a prison camp in England, what did they have in New York? What did they have at the front lines? The propaganda had portrayed America as a chaotic wasteland of unemployment and racial war. Yet, the women saw a system that functioned with the precision of a clock. The guards were relaxed because they knew the outcome was inevitable. The doctors were professional because they had no reason to be afraid. The Americans weren't fighting for survival. They were conducting a massive, well-funded industrial operation. One woman, who had been a high-ranking clerk in the signals corps, began to calculate the logistics in her head. She knew how many tons of supplies it took to move a single division. She looked at the soft white bread she had saved in her pocket and realized the war had been over long before she was captured. Germany was fighting with willpower. America was fighting with an infinite bank account. It was a realization that made their heroic defense of France look like a foolish waste of life. They thought of their brothers and fathers still dying in the trenches for a cause that was clearly, with a grilled cheese sandwich, became symbol of their disillusionment. The women began to look at their captors with awe and resentment. They started to ask questions they had never dared to ask before. Why is your bread so white? How much meat does a soldier get? Is it true everyone has a car? The answers were even more devastating than the food. The Americans didn't realize they were bragging. They spoke of home with a casualness that confirmed the German women's fear. They were fighting a war against a future they could never achieve. The ideological fracture was complete. They still wore the symbols on their uniforms, but the spirit was gone. They felt like ghosts in a world that had moved on. The camp was no longer a place of punishment. It was a sanctuary from the lies of their leaders. But with that sanctuary came a devastating guilt. Mathematically and calorically impossible. The Blitzmodell were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were witnesses to its obsolescence. They had been conquered not by the sword, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of a superior civilization's leftovers. By the winter of 1944, the atmosphere inside the enclosure had transformed from a prison into a laboratory of the soul. The German women no longer looked at the fence as barrier to their freedom, but as a shield from the collapse of their old lives. The letters arriving from Germany were now stained with the ash of firebombed cities. Their mothers wrote of grinding acorns into dust to make bread. Their sisters spoke of the winter hill rations that were nothing more than watery cabbage. Every time the women sat down in the American mess hall, the guilt was a physical weight. They were eating cheese, butter, and meat while their nation was starving in the dark. This was the ultimate psychological victory of the Allies. They didn't need to torture these women. They simply had to show them what a functional, wealthy society looked like. The grilled cheese sandwich had been the first blow. But the daily consistency of American logistics was the finishing strike. In May 1945, the news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the camp. There were no cheers, and there were no outbursts of grief. There was only a heavy, hollow silence. For these women, the war had already ended months ago on the day. They realized their leaders had sent them to fight a giant that could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its heroes. The process of repatriation was slow and painful. When the trucks finally arrived to take them back to the ruins of their homeland, the women didn't leave as the proud, indoctrinated girls who had been captured at Chartres. They left as strangers to their own culture. As they boarded the transport ships to cross back to the continent, many of them looked back at the camp's kitchen chimneys one last time. They weren't missing the prison. They were mourning the clarity they had found there. Returning to Germany was a second trauma. They walked through cities that were nothing but skeletal remains of brick and twisted metal. They saw their families skeletal, gray-faced, and haunted by hunger. When the women tried to describe their time in captivity, they found they couldn't. How do you tell a starving mother that the enemy gave you melted cheese and white bread every day? How do you explain that the monsters you were supposed to fear were actually architects of an abundance your country couldn't even imagine? One of the radio operators later recounted that 4 years after the war, she couldn't look at a piece of cheese without feeling a surge of anger. Not anger at the Americans, but at the regime that had asked her to die for a lie. The sandwich incident wasn't just meal. It was the moment she realized that power isn't just about how many people you can kill, it's about how many people you can provide for. Historians who studied the testimonies of these female POWs noticed a recurring theme: the collapse of the internal front. These women were the first to stop believing. They were the first to see that the Third Reich was a house of cards built on the illusion of superiority. The American grilled cheese sandwich had acted as a truth serum, bypassing the years of brainwashing and targeting the most primal human instinct: survival. The story of the German women at the POW camp remains one of the most fascinating footnotes of World War II. It serves as a reminder that the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't always a gun. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat an ideology is to show its followers a better version of the world. As the sun set on the ruins of the 1940s, these women moved into the future, helping to rebuild a new Germany. But they carried a secret knowledge with them, a knowledge born in a mess hall in England. They knew that empires are not destroyed by fire alone. They are destroyed when their people realize that the enemy has a heart, a system, and a simple sandwich that tastes like the truth.